Okay, so get this. Chinese exports have been like surging lately.
Yeah, like crazy.
It's record-breaking numbers, like a tidal wave of goods coming from China, and that's what we're going to deep dive into today
Yeah.
and figure out what's driving it and what it all means.
The numbers are really pretty impressive.
Yeah,
But like most things in economics, there's a lot more to the story than you might think at first.
exactly. And that's why we have our main source today, which is a
Yeah.
really interesting article from the Washington Post
Mhm.
by Christian Shepard and Vic Chiang.
Right.
And it paints a really vivid picture of this whole export boom and all the different economic and political kind of forces that are at play.
Yeah, it's pretty complex.
Yeah.
There are a lot of moving pieces to this.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
So let's start with just like the scale
Yeah.
of this whole surge. In December alone, Chinese exports jumped by 10.7%,
Wow.
which led to a total annual increase of 7.1%
Yeah.
compared to like the year before.
Right.
So that brought the total value of their exports to a staggering $3.4 trillion.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine how much that is. It's a lot.
You could think of it like this. We're adding on the trade volume of a medium-sized country to the global market in just 1 year.
Wow.
And that gives you a sense of the magnitude of China's manufacturing and how much they're really impacting the world economy.
It's really mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And of course, the Chinese government is really excited about all this,
Right.
They're saying this surge is like a sign of their economic recovery. And it's fueled, at least in part, by all the things they're doing to support manufacturing and boost exports.
Yeah. And while those government initiatives have definitely played a role, it's important to remember that this surge isn't only happening because of their policies.
Yeah.
There's some other things going on too, including some that might not be so positive in the long run.
Okay, now you've got me really intrigued.
Okay.
What else is happening behind the scenes?
Well, one major factor is all this uncertainty about potential new tariffs that President Trump has proposed.
Mhm.
These tariffs could range from 10% to as high as 60%.
And American businesses are obviously worried about this, and they're rushing to stock up on Chinese goods before prices potentially go way up.
So it's like a preemptive buying spree because everyone's scared of what might happen.
Exactly. This huge demand is artificial. It's created by everyone anticipating higher prices in the future.
Right.
It's kind of like blowing air into a balloon.
Uh-huh.
It might look impressive for a little while, but it's not going to last.
Right. So then what happens when that balloon bursts?
Well, once we know for sure what's happening with these tariffs, demand is probably going to drop,
Yeah,
and we could see a correction in the market.
makes sense.
And it's also worth noting that the Lunar New Year holiday probably played a role in that December surge too, because businesses were trying to finalize orders before the celebrations began.
So it was like a combination of preemptive buying and this holiday rush that created that record-breaking month.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that this December surge is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
What we're really seeing is that this export boom is part of a larger strategic shift in how China is approaching their economy.
Okay.
They're moving away from just being a place where you get cheap goods, and they're focusing more and more on high-tech products.
So they're not just making more stuff, they're making more like sophisticated stuff.
Exactly. Take a look at the numbers, for example.
Okay.
Exports of electric vehicles went up by 13%, 3D printers by 33%, and industrial robots by a huge 45%.
Wow.
Those industries have so much potential for growth, and China is working to become a big player in those sectors.
That's a pretty big shift.
Yeah.
What does all this mean for businesses and investors who are listening? What opportunities or challenges does this present?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
As China moves up this value chain, it's going to create both opportunities and challenges for businesses all around the world. Companies in those high-tech sectors really need to pay attention to what China's doing. They need to understand the competition and figure out ways to partner up or collaborate.
Yeah. So it's not just about competing with China's, but also potentially working with them.
Exactly. There's a lot of potential for partnerships and sharing knowledge that could benefit everyone. But of course, there are challenges too.
Yeah.
As China starts to dominate these industries, it raises concerns about intellectual property protection and fair competition.
So it's this balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to benefit from China's rise as a tech powerhouse, but also manage the risks.
You said that perfectly. It's complicated and there aren't any easy answers.
Right.
But one thing is for sure, China is making big moves to lock in their position in the global economy, and everyone around the world is feeling the impact.
So it's interesting how China is like projecting this strength
Yeah.
globally,
Right.
while they're also facing all these problems at home. We've talked about some of them,
Yeah.
like the property market struggling and consumer spending being weak.
hmm
How does this big export surge fit into that whole picture?
Yeah, it's a weird kind of paradox. The export boom is giving their economy a boost in the short term, creating jobs and bringing in revenue,
Right.
but it could also hide those deeper problems.
Oh, so could you explain that a little more?
Yeah, sure. If China relies too much on exports to grow their economy, they might not address those domestic issues.
Okay.
They might put off reforms that are needed to get people spending more at home, reduce inequality, and create a more sustainable economic model.
So it's like they're putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The export surge is a temporary fix that might create bigger problems later on.
So what's the solution then?
Yeah.
What could they do to create an economy that's not so dependent on exports?
Well, it's a complicated problem, but some key areas for reform would be stimulating domestic demand, fostering innovation, and promoting entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Basically, they need to make it easier for businesses to succeed and make consumers feel confident about spending their money in China.
So they need to shift their focus from just sending goods overseas to building up a strong market at home.
Exactly. They got to invest in their people, their infrastructure, and their future so they're not so reliant on demand from other countries.
Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the political side of this export surge.
Okay.
We know President Trump has been talking about putting tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yeah.
How could that affect the relationship between the two countries?
Well, those tariffs could definitely reignite some tension between the U.S. and China.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tricky situation with potential consequences for both sides.
Like, what are some of the things that could happen?
If those tariffs do go into effect, China might retaliate.
Mhm.
They could start investigating American companies that do business in China,
Okay.
or they could restrict exports of important materials used in tech manufacturing where they have a lot of control.
So it could turn into a trade war with both sides hurting each other.
That's a real possibility. And it's important to understand who the key players are on the American side.
Okay.
There are people in the administration who are called China hawks.
China hawks.
Yeah, they want to take a more aggressive approach towards China. They see China's economic and technological growth as a threat to American interests.
Oh, so these China hawks are influencing policy and pushing for a tougher stance on trade?
Exactly. Their influence might make it harder to find a compromise and de-escalate things. China, on the other hand, is trying to downplay the tension.
Okay.
They're emphasizing how trade benefits both countries. They even point to examples like Tesla's success in China as a win-win situation.
So it seems like they're trying to appeal to businesses and highlight the good things that come from cooperation. But with these China hawks around, is that strategy likely to work?
It's hard to say for sure. Actions speak louder than words, and the political climate is pretty tense right now. The outcome will depend on a lot of factors: economic interests, political maneuvering, and strategic calculations on both sides.
So we've talked about the political tension, the economic reasons behind the surge and potential challenges for China. Now let's talk about the big thing that everyone's talking about, the trade surplus. The gap between what China exports and what they import was huge in December, like $105 billion.
Yeah.
Why is that such a sensitive issue?
Well, trade surplus is a major sticking point between the U.S. and China. To understand why, let's look at what a trade surplus actually means. Basically, it means that China is selling a lot more stuff to the U.S. than it's buying from us.
So it's like China's making a lot of money selling us things, but we're not selling them as much in return. Why is that such a problem?
From the American perspective, this massive surplus makes people worry about unfair trade practices.
Okay.
They argue that China is manipulating its currency to keep its exports artificially cheap, which gives them an unfair advantage in the global market.
Oh.
This fuels concerns about job losses in the U.S. and accusations that China is winning at the expense of American workers.
So it's not just about the numbers themselves, but also the stories and perceptions they create.
Exactly. The trade surplus becomes a symbol of this bigger economic imbalance.
Right.
And it feeds into anxieties about China's growing economic power. It makes it harder to find common ground.
So what could happen if this trade surplus keeps growing?
Well, it could put more pressure on the U.S. to take protectionist measures,
Like what?
like putting even more tariffs on Chinese goods or creating stricter trade regulations.
Yeah.
This could really escalate tensions and make it harder to resolve trade disputes through negotiation and diplomacy.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, you could say that a big trade surplus creates anxieties which lead to protectionist measures, which then further strain the relationship, making it harder to fix the trade imbalance itself.
Sounds like a complicated mess.
It is. Finding a solution will require both sides to get past oversimplified narratives and really try to address the root causes of this trade imbalance.
Yeah, it seems like what's happening in China affects the whole world.
Absolutely. We live in a globalized world where economic and political events in one country can have huge consequences everywhere else.
Right.
Understanding these complex connections is more important than ever.
It feels like things are kind of at a tipping point, you know?
Yeah.
China's trying to become this global economic leader,
Mm-hmm.
but their actions are making some people nervous and causing some tension with the U.S.
Mm.
What are some things we should be watching for to see how this all plays out?
Well, one big thing to keep an eye on is how the new Trump administration handles trade talks with China.
Yeah.
Will they stick with this hardline approach and use tariffs, or will they try to be more diplomatic and work together?
Okay, so those early signals from the administration will be really important.
Exactly. It's kind of like a chess game
Uh-huh.
where each side is thinking carefully about their next move.
Right.
We also need to watch how China responds to what the U.S. does.
Yeah.
Will they retaliate with their own countermeasures or try to calm things down by making concessions or negotiating?
So there's a lot of uncertainty right now,
Yeah,
and that's probably not good for the global economy.
you're right. Uncertainty can make businesses hesitant to invest,
Mm-hmm.
and consumers might hold back on spending,
Yeah.
and that can slow down the whole system. We need some level of predictability and stability for the global economy to run smoothly.
So in a perfect world, what would be the best outcome for both China and the U.S.?
Ideally, both sides would realize that it's better to cooperate than to fight.
Right.
They would sit down and have some honest discussions, address concerns about trade practices, and find ways to work together so everyone benefits.
Yeah, like a win-win situation.
Exactly. A healthy and balanced trade relationship would be good for both economies.
Okay, but let's be real for a second.
Yeah.
What's a more likely scenario?
We might see a period of tension and uncertainty that drags on for a while.
Okay.
Both sides will probably be cautious, testing each other's limits and trying to get an advantage.
Uh-huh.
It could be a long process with times when things escalate and times when things calm down as they try to figure out this complicated relationship.
So more of this back and forth between the two countries.
Exactly. It'll take some serious diplomacy and commitment to dialogue to keep things from turning into a full-blown trade war.
Yeah, that would be bad.
Definitely. That's the biggest risk we have to watch out for.
So if we had to sum all this up into one key takeaway for our listeners, what would be?
The world economy is changing in a big way. China is becoming a major economic force, and that's shifting the balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
Their relationship with the U.S. is at a crossroads,
Yeah.
and the choices both countries make in the next few months and years will have a huge impact on the global economy.
It sounds like we're entering a new era in global trade and geopolitics.
We are. And understanding what's happening is crucial for anyone who wants to navigate this complex and rapidly changing world.
That's a really good point to end on.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot today exploring the reasons behind this Chinese export surge, what it means, and what might happen next.
Mm-hmm.
This is a story that's still developing, so stay curious, keep learning, and come to your own conclusions.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.